All right, it's 6:03. Gave people a little bit of time here, and I'm sure as I'm having some house cleaning comments, I'm sure more will trickle in, so we'll just admit folks as they come in. Um, I just want to say welcome. It's good to meet with you guys here this evening. My name's Clint Bain. I'm the district director and the ag agent for Golden Prairie Extension District, and um, just wanted to invite and welcome everyone here tonight. We're actually streaming this on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as Zoom. So right now in Zoom, we got 21 participants, but I'm sure that'll increase here, and then those other venues, I don't know quite yet what those numbers are looking like, but we really do appreciate you guys joining us tonight. This is actually a collaboration of several districts. Number one would be Cottonwood Extension District, Golden Prairie, Midway, Phillips, Rooks, Post Rock, and Walnut Creek. So what that means is actually some of the behind the scenes teammates here is Alicia Bohr from the Cottonwood Extension District. She's the ag agent there. Myself, Clint Bain. The other Clint is Clint Laughlin, is the livestock agent for the Midway District. We have Rachel Boyle, the ag agent for Phillips Rooks District. Sandra Wick is the crop production agent, pulling double duty with livestock production as well right now in the Post Rock District. And we have Jared Petersilly down in Walnut Creek District, and he's the livestock agent down there. So we're actually kind of going to be behind the scenes tonight. A lot of us will be moderating those other venues, fielding questions to the presenters, and if at any time throughout tonight you guys have any questions for us, just pop them in the chat. But also, these are the people and the faces that are there on the local level, so make sure you swing by our offices if you have any follow-up questions in person as well. So just a few real brief housekeeping procedures tonight. You guys are already rock stars at this. Make sure that we keep our microphones muted and our videos turned off. That'll really help with cutting down on the distractions, and also it'll actually help us save on bandwidth. So make sure there's no tech glitches there. So if you guys could help us out with that, we'd really do appreciate it. Also, if you have any questions for the individual speakers as they're presenting, if you could just go ahead and type those in the chat on Zoom. For those of you joining via Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, go ahead and post those questions in the comments section. Obviously, those will be public, but one of us team members behind the scenes will actually be moderating those. And so we will actually take those questions and put them into the Zoom chat at the end of each one of the speakers' presentations. Like I said, as they pop into your head, go ahead and jot them down. We will not be interrupting the speakers, just so everything goes very efficient. And then towards the end of their presentation, that's when we'll regroup and look at questions. And then if you have any generic questions that you'd kind of like to ask to the whole team, we'll actually have the very end of our session tonight will be a town hall question and answer. So again, feel free to put those in the chat, and really, depending on, if you're feeling comfortable, go ahead and unmute and ask your questions at that time as well. So we just really want to make this as interactive as possible and get a lot of discussion when the time allows. So all right, so here's our excellent slate of speakers for tonight. I have the pleasure of introducing our very first speaker, Dr. Sandy Johnson. Dr. Johnson is the K-State beef reproductive physiologist. She's stationed out at Colby, and we're all really excited for her tonight to share and help us learn more about bull management considerations. So Sandy, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and you can take it away.
Okay, can you see and hear like you would expect?
Yes, looks good.
All right.
Thanks, Sandy.
You know, it's kind of hard to talk at the screen and not see anybody. So it's nice to be with you this evening. And I think we often don't give enough time to bull management. And so I'm glad we're going to spend a little time here this evening. Some topics I think we're going to, well, we're trying to keep it brief because of this venue, but hopefully I'll give you some other resources to build on from there. So when we think about bull management, often, you know, it's like if they got one of this and two of that, everything should be fine. We really don't need to worry about anything else that might go wrong. So as we focus this evening, we're going to really I want you to be thinking, is your bull management on strong footing, or is it having a little bit of slippage at times? All right, so if we just try to give a brief overview, then I want to talk about infertility risks, and breeding soundness exams is our best tool to minimize that risk. So we want to understand what those are and what to expect from one. We'll hit just a little bit on nutrition. I'm going to talk a little bit about cost, and that cost will kind of tie into that serving capacity and give you a good idea how those relate and how you can explore that more for yourself. So the recent NOMS survey is a national survey that asked beef producers a variety of questions, and one of them was what reproductive procedures were performed on the bulls in their herd in preparation for the last breeding season. So this would be considering all of the bulls in the bull battery. And on the bottom axis, we have herd size, smallest to largest. And you can see even for the largest herds that only 60% of them would be semen testing all bulls prior to breeding season. Now, if they ask the question about bulls purchased, leased, or borrowed, that rate gets up to 80 or 90%, depending on which particular category, so much higher if we're buying them, but it's still not 100%. And it seems like we try and minimize a lot of risk in our lives, and this is an area where I think people maybe underestimate the potential risk, or maybe they're just less risk adverse than myself. Now, our best option to fertility test a bull to get a true test of fertility would be to turn that bull out with cows of known fertility. However, if we're wrong about that bull, it could be very risky. We turn out a bull that is essentially sterile, we have had a great economic loss. And so I want you to think about the risk of using boards like the gentleman on the left to access this skylight working over stairs, and equate the breeding soundness exam to a better, safer setup for working over stairs. And I think I'll try and share some data that hopefully will convince you that breeding soundness exams are very important and are worth the effort to do. So there's probably a time that you've gone and not done a breeding soundness exam if we were to query this group. And so this little data set is allowing us to maybe look at a larger group of females and see what happens when we might not use a breeding soundness exam. This was a study done in Texas with some Santa Gratuitous bloodlines, and they either they had one group of bulls that they identified that had greater than 80% normal morphology of the sperm that were evaluated. The other group they called a random group, and that represented a whole range of percent of normal sperm. And some were fairly low, some were greater than 80 or greater than 90%. So it was a random group. So there's data from 2 years. And you can see each of those years, bull to cow ratio, about 1 to 25, a 6% improvement in pregnancy rate in the first year, 5% in the next year. So if you look at just for ease, a one bull to 30 cows, this 6% gets you roughly 2 more calves per bull that you turn out. Well, a BSE in general, in broad terms, it costs you about $50. So is spending $50 worth getting 2 more calves, as in this example, getting rid of some of those bulls with lower morphology? Not only does it show up in the pregnancy rate, but it also shows up in the calving distribution. This is another large data set where they group bulls based on morphology. And here, this less than 20% of abnormal would be the same thing as the greater than 80% normal. Okay, so these are the high quality sperm bulls, and then the low quality. So 4 bulls with high quality sperm in terms of normal morphology were able to sire 104 calves in the first 2 cycles. And I failed to mention they did this by DNA testing all those calves. So they identified which sire they were out of. At the same time, then those bulls with a lot of abnormal cells, 8 of them could only generate 65 calves. Right, so bull fertility is important to how many and when these cows get pregnant. And the calves that are born earlier, way more at weaning, and certainly the more we can front end load that breeding and calving season, the better off we're going to be. Now, I know there's times we really don't want to mess with these bulls. They can be cantankerous, they're big, they're hard on facilities. And so for some of us, we may need to get help working bulls. We may need to take bulls directly to the vet clinic. And I'm certainly in favor of any bull that develops an attitude problem. His next trip is through the Golden Arches, because, you know, it just... life's too precious to risk a bad attitude bull. And so we do need to be cautious, use the right facilities. But I don't care how pretty they are. If they're not nice, they need a one-way trip. So what can we expect for results from breeding soundness exams from various ages of bulls? This is some data that looked at 5 different test stations. There were 10 breeds there. You see a pretty good represented, pretty good large set of bulls. And in that group, they identified roughly 10% that were unsatisfactory breeders without even doing the semen collection. So that was either poor scrotal size, and probably in this case, bulls that just had not quite reached puberty. And then roughly 3% of those had some type of physical abnormality. Some of those can be corrected, attached frenulums, penile warts, but it just depends. And it's very important, particularly on these young bulls, to see a full extension and know that everything is all right. And then about 13% had either inadequate motility or morphology or both. So what should we expect for mature bulls? This slide illustrates another large data set, came out of Texas, and actually these are bulls that were in the Texas prison system herds. And so they had a wide range of bulls, And on the vertical axis is the proportion of bulls that failed a breeding soundness exam. And largely that was based on less than 70% normal morphology. The average overall was 26% of those bulls that failed BSE on an annual basis. Okay, 26 failed annually. And you see that that rate goes up as those bulls mature. And if you look at the broader set of data, what we hear is anywhere from 10 to 30% of bulls will fail annually. So those that aren't checking bulls prior to breeding season, each breeding season, are taking some risk. And so you know how important it is to have more live calves at weaning. And if you have a bull that's responsible for 20 to 30 or more cows to get them pregnant, and he's not able to do that, that's a tremendous economic loss. And so just can't emphasize enough that they may look fine, but they're not producing the semen that we need. Now, I probably should have perhaps started with explaining what a breeding soundness exam, but we'll cover that now. And a breeding soundness exam can be broken into three parts. It's a physical exam, needs to include the palpation of the accessory sex glands, and also a semen evaluation. And the history of this exam goes back to a bad snowstorm, I can't remember if it was 49 or 50 in the western states, and they were really concerned. I think it was like a late spring storm about frost damage on a lot of bulls. And that's kind of what started this whole breeding soundness exam, to see which bulls were still all right. And certainly frostbite is a potential problem with bulls that can be exposed to extreme wind and wind chill. So let's look a little more closely at what the breeding soundness exam is. So an important part is measuring scrotal circumference, and that scrotal circumference will change with age. And so based on the age of the bull, there's a different minimum requirement. And it's also important then to palpate the scrotum, make sure that they're moving freely within the scrotum. There are no inflammation, and the tone is good, not mushy or some indication of another type of problem. Now I'm showing you what are the new forms for the breeding soundness exam. Just a few years ago, they reviewed their procedure and updated it. So if this form doesn't look familiar to you, if you routinely do use a breeding soundness exam, I don't suppose every veterinarian is using it yet. There are probably not real significant changes. I think the form is better in terms that, particularly on this physical exam, hopefully, you're not bringing one in for BSE with a broken leg, but it's going to be very important that the feet and legs are sound of that bull if we're going to pass him. So you see all these things that should be evaluated with that breeding soundness exam. They need good vision to see cows in heat. That's part of the process. All the accessory glands need to be palpated, and that palpation will also help with the semen collection. Some of these young bulls that have been on a pretty hot ration, a lot of times will have vesiculitis, and that will result in a lot of white blood cells in the semen sample, and that is problematic. So we want to note all those things. And sometimes there's, we talk about scrotal shape, difference in size of one testicle, or how the suspension is. So all those things should be evaluated. And we also have body condition at the top as well. blank where the scrotal circumference measurement is included. The other part of the breeding soundness exam then is to collect a semen sample and evaluate that semen. The minimum for normal cells is 70%. Some of the things I was showing you, you saw the advantage of the 80%, and I don't know if we know where that fine line is, but the semen should be evaluated, and I'm just showing some examples of different types of defects that might be seen. Another change then in this updated BSC form is how they're classifying some of these abnormalities to tie back a little bit more of when they occur, how they might be caused, if there was an injury or animal with a fever. And so that's part of the reason that they changed that. But the overall morphology hasn't changed. I will tell you that I think Canadians require a much higher level of motility to pass. I think the general recommendation is about 30% modal, and so that's cells observed moving forward in a straight line. And so we're not quite as stringent, and I'm not sure if that's because temperature control is important when trying to assess sperm cells, and that's kind of a giving some extra elbow room for some of the conditions they might be collected in. But passing at 70% might not impress your academic teacher, and so in some regards, we're not putting a real high hurdle on these bulls for morphology to pass. All right, so once all those things have been accessed, the person evaluating them will indicate one of these three classifications. And notice it says satisfactory potential breeder. It doesn't say, we promise you this bull will get 100 cows pregnant. Potential breeder. And again, this is a snapshot on this given day, and fertility can change. And so that we recognize the limitation, but it's still more information and a good way to minimize risk and identify really those that are clearly unsatisfactory. Some young bulls may deferred. Usually it takes around 30 days from when they are showing, when we would say they first reach puberty, to when they the sperm analysis would look more like a mature bull in terms of any defects and that type of thing. If the bull is injured or gets sick and has a fever, it takes about 60 days for sperm to go from spermatids at the beginning point clear through to mature sperm cells. So in some cases, then the reexamination would be after 2 months. Now, what a BSE doesn't do is assess libido, or the willingness of that bull to mate. One assessment done by Andy Barth in Canada, who's done a lot of bull work, about 5% of mature bulls, even though they had a satisfactory semen evaluation, were physically unable to service cows. And so this is a weakness of the breeding soundness exam. So we need, as producers, make sure that we take the time to observe these bulls mating. Also doesn't assess serving capacity. And unfortunately, we haven't come up with, there's people that have worked on libido tests and serving capacity tests, and they're not highly repeatable. They're quite cumbersome to conduct. And so it's a weak part in our system. So producers' observation to see these things happen is an important part of minimizing risk of failure of a bull. then I want to emphasize then that the BSE is not a lifetime insurance policy. It should be done prior to each breeding season. And we know that injury or illness or heat stress can all change what that semen evaluation will look at. A lot of times if we're doing research, we're trying to use the semen from a single collection because it will vary from one collection to another. And that just is a way of trying to minimize variation. But you know that not everything stays the same is the point. All right, I want to talk now just a little bit about some key developmental periods in bulls and a little bit about nutrition. And the take home is that really this what happens before weaning is really important. And the final testy size is determined before weaning, and that nutrition level is going to drive age at puberty. And really the post-weaning nutrition has minimal effects. And I'll show you a little data to support that. I don't want to say there's no impacts, but not maybe to what you might expect. I'm going to use a few slides that came from one of our applied reproductive strategies virtual meetings that was held last fall. You can access these at beefrepro.org and essentially see the entire session. This was essentially 4 speakers, all devoted to bulls. I'm going to try and pull out a few things so you can look at their slides and watch those videos. So I would encourage you to do that if you want more on a particular topic. David Kinney shared a study where they looked at Holstein bull calves. They either put them on a high nutritional diet early in life through about 6 months of age, high or low. And so this was about early, these calves gained about, in the high treatment, about 1.7 pounds per day up to 2.6 as they got older. And the low treatment, these calves gained 1 to about 1.25 pounds during that first 6 months of life. Then in the factorial arrangement, then they either went to continued on high or high to low. Half of the low continued on low, half of the low animals were switched to high. This just shows the body weight on the vertical axis. And as you would expect, here's weeks of age on the horizontal axis. Calves on the higher plane of nutrition increased body weight considerably compared to those on the lower plane. Here's the post 6 month period, and those weight gains would continue as you would expect. You see the calves that were on high, and went to low, they really slow down. Whereas the low going to high, outgain those. All right, let's look at what happened then to scrotal circumference is shown in both of these slides. Prior to 6 months on the left, weeks of age on the bottom. You see the high plane of nutrition. These calves were a little over 20 centimeters at 6 months. The low were just over 16. When we go to the post 6 months, notice our scale changes slightly, and the high maintained that, but the low, even going to high, this would be the intermediate line there, just aren't able to catch up with the scrotal size of those that had that early high plane of nutrition. And so what that tells us is how critical that early nutrition is to building that factory and the size of the testis. Now, this is a slide from Zach McFarland from Cal Poly. He runs their bull tests there. And this is his slide essentially summarizing some of the key effects in semen quality, what impacts negatively semen quality post-weaning. And that's really those high energy diets that can add to really scrotal fat. The scrotal circumference would increase, but sperm production goes down. It is negative in terms of sperm transport. motility, increases abnormalities. And on the right here is just what we call a thermogram. And some of the ways they've looked at some of these changes then is get a thermal image of the testes and see what that temperature gradient looks like. Recently, Carl Dahlin has worked, Carl's at North Dakota State, and worked with Tom Gary. Tom was doing the semen analysis. And so Carl had these bulls either on these are mature bulls outside of the breeding season, one group on a increasing energy balance and the other for declining for 112 days. And the next year they reversed those treatments, and the ones that were in a declining went to the increased energy balance and vice versa. So as you would expect, the body weight was certainly impacted by those diet changes, and scrotal circumference followed those body weight changes. So we did decrease the factory size. But when they looked at the fresh semen, there were really no major impacts on quality. And Tom Gary has been doing a lot of work with different computer-assisted analysis. There's what's called a CASA machine, and that can see things better than we can with the naked eye. And so he evaluated that semen. So he used the frozen thawed semen so he could do that, get it transferred and used. And really no big changes in that as we might expect. Tom Gary, another one of those talks, emphasized this is his summary slide. They also did some mineral nutrition stuff to pre-weaning, post-weaning, really minimal effects on the sperm quality. And of course, he mentions here that overfeeding really has the greatest negative effects that they've seen. All right, moving along then, I want to just share with you my bull cost for pregnancy. I have a spreadsheet where I can update this, and this is really full cost, depreciation, interest, assuming 4 years of bull use, 10% bad bull factor, right? So I'm not sure that a lot of people look at their full cost of bull use, but this uses VAR management data for other inputs. And we're looking at 3 different pregnancy rates. I've included 2 different bull to cow ratios, and I'm giving you a really cheap bull, and then I don't know what the average price is going to be this year, but wanted to point out some key differences that we can get at looking at something like this. All right, if we go from $4,500 to $5,000 purchase price, that's about what, $8 difference in cost per pregnancy. But if we go from using that bull on 20 cows versus 30, that's a much bigger difference, okay, in that cost per pregnancy. You can find a very similar spreadsheet in one that's on Ag Manager that compares natural service bulls to AI breeding costs. And you can use it for comparison, but you can also use it to calculate bull costs. So just trying to summarize the big point here is that if we're able to use these bulls more fully, so going in the range of values I showed in that prior screen, if we can add 10 cows to each bull, that's reducing our cost of pregnancy about $36. So that's important if we feel like we can take that risk. This $500 purchase price difference, essentially about 5 pounds of weaning weight would account for that change in the cost of pregnancy. So understand what's driving your cost per pregnancy, and looking at that full cost is a good way to do it, and that's what the economists tell me. I want to touch just briefly then on serving capacity. The NOM study tells us that in the national average, people are using about 24 cows per mature bull, 17 cows per yearling bull. We know that age is important in determining that serving capacity. I just wanted to drive that home, looking at the impact of bull age on total sperm number. This is total sperm number on the vertical axis and bull age across the bottom axis. You see we've got a good number of bulls in each category. And you see an increase then in that sperm factory as those bulls get older. In some parts of this, you maybe see a little tendency, but we really tend to drop off in bull numbers.
You want to get one of those other tables?
No, I need your computer here.
Age. Okay. Then the other thing I would share is that if we use bulls all of the same age in a breeding group, pregnancy rate tends to be higher than if they're in a mixed group. This is a little bit of data from Argentina, and I wanted to share it because it pushed that bull to cow ratio a little bit more. This is in kind of flat grassland country in Argentina, the best I can interpret. And this is the pregnancy rates after 2 cycles, so 40, 45 days of breeding. And you see very similar pregnancy rates for all except this third herd, with some indication that maybe this group of cows that had the fewer bulls was in a little poorer body condition. But what it shows you is that we can use these bulls further, but it's hard to identify perhaps those that we can and we can't. And to kind of support that, I'm sharing a slide of Allison Van Enemans, who presented this at our Applied Reproductive Strategies in 2012. And they DNA sampled calves from 3 different ranches. You see varying numbers of breeding seasons. And what you see is we have a range in the number of calves sired per bull. 6 to 41 to 47. Not everybody's carrying an equal load. Now, one of the things we don't know is that the bull that only sired 1 calf, if he had inseminated as many cows, but something in the timing or the competition allowed another bull to win out, and that's an area that we wish we knew more about and able to predict ahead of time. But there's a lot of the variation there. So with mature bulls, I certainly testing them every year, like to try and get as many cows behind them as you can, but we don't always know where the duds are, and when a mature bull is no longer doing as much work as you think he is. So just trying to summarize then, I think it's important to recognize the importance of breeding soundness exams and minimize that risk, recognize the limitations of those exams, and know that we need to watch what's happening during the breeding season. Of course, we have to watch for injuries, but making sure, particularly young bulls, they're getting a full intromission and doing the needed work. Do you need to avoid overfeeding, avoid excess fat in the scrotum? That's the biggest negative effect. Young bulls still need to continue growing that first year, maybe a target of 2 pounds per day, but that's not going to make them too fat. So just understand the trade-offs with the higher energy diets. And then hopefully you got think a little bit about cost and what drives those costs. And, if you can take advantage of serving capacity increases, would do so, but understanding we don't have as much information we'd like on minimizing the risk of doing that. So I think I've used up my time, and I'll turn it back to Clint now.
Okay, Sandy. This is Clint Laughlin. I do have a question to throw to you. Could you just define for us the difference between morphology and motility?
You bet, Clinton. I should have been more clear of that. So Motility is what we're interested in, is having those cells move forward in a linear fashion. We don't want to see them swimming in a circle, so it's forward linear movement. And then the morphology, if you think back to the slide where I showed the different shapes of the sperm head, that's what we're looking for, is different defects in that sperm head. And it could be a double head, it could be a proximal droplet that's should have shed from the tail and is up near the head, might be what we call vacuoles, or almost think of a hole in the head is another way to think of it. So the morphology is really largely the shape and fitness of the sperm head.
Great. Thank you. That was really good presentation, Sandy. Thank you. Everybody, again, my name's Clint Laughlin. I am the livestock agent for the Midway district, which is Russell and Ellsworth County. And it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Alicia Bohr. Lish is the Ag and Natural Resources Agent for the Cottonwood district, and a colleague of mine. And this evening she is going to talk to us a little bit about basically vaccine storage and handling considerations. So Lish, I'll let you take it away.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Clint. Like Clint said, I'm going to share my screen really quick. Like Clint said, my name is Alicia Bohr. I'm one of the Agriculture and Natural Resource Agents for the Cottonwood District, which is Barton and Ellis counties. I am located in the Great Bend office most of the time. I'm going to talk really quick about proper handling and administration of cattle health products. So let's get started. The first thing, just a little housekeeping. This came out a couple years ago, so everybody should be pretty understanding of the veterinary client-patient relationship and what it entails, because most of your medications that you would get require having a veterinary client-patient relationship. And so basically, just an overview, it assumes that the vet is familiar with your operation and how everything is run. They've been out on your grounds at least once, so they know kind of the layout. They know what you are doing with your animals and what you're administering to them. It also has the owner or you that has the cattle, you are going to follow the directions that are either on the label or what the vet tells you. You're not going to go off label or medicate something in an improper way by being able to have that medication and giving it yourself. So the vet is also available for follow-up. So you have a relationship where you can call them, ask questions, or give them or get them to come out and help you out if you need it. So this is an important relationship to foster and be able to keep, just because they are your medical informants on being able to tell you what's going on with your animals and how to keep your animals as healthy as possible. So the first thing, we'll start out with the quality control of animal health. Basically, with quality control, most of your medications that you're going to be administering have to be between a 35 and 45 degree Fahrenheit temperature. So that means that they need to be refrigerated. When they're being shipped to either yourself or to wherever you're going to purchase them from, your vet office or somewhere like that, they would be shipped with either cold packs or in a refrigerated truck, something along that line, to ensure that they are kept at that proper temperature. If they are being delivered to your house, you need to ensure that you are there, or somebody will be there when they are supposed to be delivered to your house, and that they are at the proper temperature when you get them, that the cold packs are still cold on the inside and they haven't warmed up. The picture here is actually from the K-State veterinarian offices. They had a delivery where the delivery wasn't there at the time that it was supposed to originally, and it got left outside, and the cool packs had thawed by the time they found it and got to it, and so all of that had to be thrown out. For a producer, that could be hundreds and hundreds of dollars, and you don't want to do that. So ensure, especially with FedEx and UPS and even the Postal Service, in all honesty, they track them almost to your doorway anymore. So you should be able to know when they're coming and keep an eye out for them. If you are purchasing them from your vet or from another store, you would have to transport them with ice packs. This helps keep them cool from your house, from where you are to where you get home or to your farm. Always take a cooler, and with the ice packs, either put some brown paper, a newspaper, or even bubble wrap between those ice packs and the medications so that they don't get too cold. You can get them too cold, and that causes issues as well. So once again, storage matters. You can buy one of these fancy little coolers down here that has the holes in it for you to be able to put your vaccination guns into. Those work excellent. They are also expensive. One of my colleagues showed last week, she just got a styrofoam container that had medications that had been sent, and she put a couple holes into the top of it that would fit the vaccination gun, and that worked just as well. So if you don't have to spend a couple $100s on a cooler, you can also just use a regular cooler. It keeps it out of the sunlight, it keeps it cool, or also on cold days, such as the past couple days, if you would have to be working cattle on those days, I hope not, but if you would have to, it will keep it warm because you don't want it to freeze. You want to keep it in that range. So always make sure that you are keeping it the way it needs to be kept so that it has the best efficacy by the time you get it into the animal. A little talk on refrigerators. An interesting thing is that a lot of refrigerators that are used for storing your vaccinations and all of that, fail to maintain your safe zone of 35 to 45 degrees. Normally what happens is you get a new refrigerator for the inside of your house, you're upgrading, or just you need a new one. And so the old one goes out to the shop. Well, now it's no longer in climate control or as climate controlled as it was in the house. And it's an older model. You probably used it for a good 10 years, maybe longer. And so it's just not as effective as it used to be. Actually, University of Arkansas, out of 180 refrigerators tested, 76% were unacceptable. So that's one thing that you need to be thinking about. If you have a refrigerator, an older one that you are using, you can get a digital, just from Walmart, Amazon, anything like that. You can get a digital thermometer that you can put in there, and most of them will have a high and a low for the day. So you can look at a 24-hour range, and it will tell you if it stayed within that range or not. And so that's something good to be monitoring so that you are ensuring that what the product that you're putting in your animal is the best product that you can put in your animal. So another important thing is treatment records. One of my old supervisors used to always say, if you don't write it down, it never happened. And that is true in almost everything that you would do in life, but especially for animals. You really need to have the date your animal grew, your individual animal, if you're treating a small amount, or your group. The products that you use. This is important so that if there is an issue that comes out, you can go back to your vet, once again, that vet-client relationship, and talk to them about what happened with the product. And if there is something wrong with the product, then they can contact the manufacturer and be able to figure out what happened. And sometimes there is a monetary compensation for that, but not without having all of your records. Also have the dose on there and a withdrawal time on there so that you know when you can ship those animals out if it's something that you're processing them right before they leave. When you are using vaccines, I've mentioned it before, protect them from freezing especially. It can start denaturing a lot of your vaccines, but also protect them from sunlight. You don't want sun directly on them. You also don't mix your vaccines together into the same syringe. Use different syringes for each vaccine. Some vaccines will react against each other and then it makes it not as effective. It is very important to mix up only what you can use in an hour. If you go much past that hour, it starts denaturing. You can start having issues with it, and then you're not giving a quality product to your animal. And make sure that you're keeping them mixed. So when you do have a vaccine that would need to have the diluent added into it, these are the ones that have the cakes at the bottom of them. You will use a transfer needle. And with those transfer needles, make sure that they're clean. Make sure that they don't have any rust on them, that they're not bent or anything like that. They're relatively inexpensive. A lot of places will actually give them to you. So it's something that you can get a new one if you need one. When you enter into the containers, always enter into the diluent first. The glass vial actually is negatively pressurized. So if you pop into that one first, you're going to lose that ability for it to draw all of that sterile saline into the vial. When you are shaking them up, do not shake them, gently roll them to mix. Shaking them can damage them as well. So you want to make sure that you're gently rolling them and then keep them mixed like the previous slide said. Make sure that they don't come apart. When you're using different vaccines, make sure you're marking your syringes so that you know what you're putting in each vaccine. Once again, you don't want to mix them in the syringe. It can damage what you are trying to put into your animals. Don't re-enter a bottle with a used needle. It is recommended to use a needle for every 10 to 15 head, which is convenient because by the time you run out of the vaccine, you would need to put it back into the bottle. You just get a new needle, put it back into the original bottle, and draw up what you need for the next 10 or 15 head. Keep equipment clean, but do not use disinfectants. Disinfectants can damage. They can kill off the modified lives and they can damage the killed. So if you're using a disinfectant, you can basically make it where it's ineffective of what you're trying to put in your animal. So you want to make sure that you are keeping it clean with hot water beforehand or wiping it down and just keeping your area clean and as sterile as can be. When you do have your syringes that you can reuse, here's just a quick way of washing them and making sure that you can reuse them for the next time. Use almost boiling water. So as hot as you possibly can get it without it boiling, and wash the outside of the syringe, and then take apart the barrel. Do not use soap. If you use soap on the inside, that can cause issues because that soap will leave a little bit of a film, which can damage your vaccine that you would put in there. Lubricants also are not considered a good idea. They used to say to put a little bit of mineral oil or Vaseline to keep the rings a little bit better, but that is not a good idea anymore. They found that that can actually damage the vaccines also. So you just want to inspect them, replace them if you need to. Once again, they're not that expensive and that would be better than ruining your vaccine. To clean the inside of it, really, really hot water and draw it up into the syringe. Do this several times and then make sure that you dry them completely and then put them in a Ziploc bag to keep them clean, seal it, and then store it somewhere where you know you're going to find it and keep it out of the way. One good idea is the refrigerator where you keep all of your vaccines. Then you always know where it is. With your needles, I mentioned to change your needles after about 10 to 15 head. That's because they do get dull. and you don't want to be shoving it through and causing issues. Also, if your needle bends, it's like any other wire. The more it bends, the more you have a spot that's going to be weak, and you really don't want to put that into another animal and then have it break off into the animal. If they become contaminated, you are basically putting that needle through hair, hide, whatever is on their hide, any kind of dirt or anything like that. And so if it's damaged or bird or anything like that, basically you're taking any of that dirt that is already on that needle and putting it inside the animal. And that's going to cause infections, abscesses, and make it where the vaccine that you're trying to put in isn't going to be as effective either. So it is a good idea to change it often. A lot of people are actually looking at changing it every time, and that would limit any kind of bloodborne infection. So any kind of anaplasmosis, if you would give a shot to one animal that happened to have anaplas, and then give it to an animal that did not, that would be very detrimental. So it is a good idea to almost change your needle every time. Injection site, you want to make sure that you go sub-Q and into the neck, and we will talk a little bit more about that. But if you look, they're at a 45-degree angle, and that will help you get that sub-Q in the sweet spot of the triangle on their neck. Now, with the triangle on the neck that we teach, it is ahead of the point of the shoulder. You don't want to go into that shoulder because that's where a lot of your cuts of meat are, and you don't want to be puncturing into those. B, as you see, is the vertebrae. So that's where your spinal column is, and you want to make sure that you are not hitting that. And you also don't want to go below that because that's where a lot of your major veins are. That's where your trachea is. So you want to stay away from that area. The one that people accidentally hit the most is actually C, which is the nuchal ligament. Now, an animal that has to hold their head up, that is a quadruped, they use that nuchal ligament to be able to hold their head up. Us walking on two legs, we don't have that, but they have that extra ligament to be able to hold their head up. So when you see a cow after vaccinations and they're with their head down, they're not wanting to drink, they're not really wanting to move, most likely it's not a vaccine response, but it is a damage to that ligament that is causing them not to move around, and that area is sore, and any motion would then make it hurt worse. So that is something to be able to make sure that you're looking out for. And so inside that white area on the cow is where you want to give your shots. This is just another on an actual cow, but if you look, it shows you exactly where that triangle is. With that triangle, you want to, when you're in the chute, use a one-handed technique. They used to always, when I was in college even, we talked about a two-handed technique where you would pull out the skin and tent the skin and then give the shot. Well, you've got a large animal there that is probably not appreciating the shot you're going to give them. And if they start bouncing around or moving away, you can easily give yourself the shot, which is not a good idea. So it's better if you use the one-handed technique and just go in at a 45-degree angle to be able to get into that sub-Q area. When you are in that sub-Q area, you can actually move the needle around just a little bit, so you know that you're not in the muscle or anything else. There's just another look at how to give it properly so that you are keeping yourself safe. On smaller animals, if you don't have enough room in the triangle spot to give the injections, you can also give it in the dewlap. But with a lot of your British breeds, which is what we're mainly going to see around here, they don't have as much of a dewlap to be able to give very much of an injection into. So that is your absolute last recommendation of a place to be able to give a safe shot. Here's just a quick little diagram. If you're doing an intramuscular, you would go just straight in. to be able to hit that muscle, but most of our injections are that subcutaneous. So you want to be below the skin, but before the muscle. And once again, you can kind of feel where you are once you get the shot in, especially when you go in at that angle. Now, appropriate needle size, basically what you want to do is use the smallest round needle that you possibly can, the smallest gauge on the size of animal that you have. And just like shotguns, the gauges on needles are the same. So a larger number means a smaller gauge. So here is a nice, simple, appropriate needle size chart. If anybody wants this, I'd be happy to send this this presentation on so that you can have this. But it is just a nice, simple way to be able to see what one that you would want to use for the size of cow that you are giving your injection into, so that they have a lesser chance of bending, but you're giving the most vaccine that you can in one shot. So when you are giving shots, you want to space it at least 4 inches apart, and that is usually the width of one person's hand. Now, I don't know if I would suggest keeping your hand there while you have 2 needles, but you can always, you'll get used to seeing that. But it's usually about the width of one person's hand, and you want to keep them apart, and you want to put them side by side, not up and down. If you put them up and down, you're going to have issues with gravity, where the one vaccine will go into the other one. Once again, we don't want to mix vaccines. So if you put them side by side, then it will make it where they don't, as gravity pushes them down, they're not going to mix and mingle. Injection volume, always read the product label, but the maximum that you really want to put in any one site is 10 milliliters. So if you need to give 18 mils to an animal, you would want to break that up between 2 different spots, 9 mils each or something like that, because if you put too much in an area, there's only so much room beneath the skin before it starts pushing it out. So then you're going to lose some of the vaccine and have it come out of the cow rather than stay in and do what it needs to do. So always make sure that you are not putting too much in a spot. You've got several spots on the neck on either side that you can use. One last little quick thing that we'll talk about is implants. Implants are used with a lot of people to increase their feed effectiveness, but getting it in the right spot is important. So if you look at this this page, sorry, I lost that word. You want to go in between the 2 cartilage ribs on the side of the ear. So when you feel a cow's ear, you will feel these 2 ribs, and you want to go in between those so that you are in the center of the ear. Most of the time that is the best place, because the lower portion of the ear is where a lot of people put tags. And then up at the top, sometimes you'll get tags up on the top. So the center is the best place to put it. Your secondary spot would be the upper portion of the ear, but you want to make sure it's right smack dab in the middle. And when you pull it out, a lot of times those implant guns will pull out, and you can still feel that the implant is right exactly where it needs to be. This is one thing that you do want to make sure that you are sanitizing between animals, because it is not something that is going to be damaged. So you want to use a disinfectant soaked sponge and clean each side of the needle before you put it into the next animal's ear. This will keep it clean and keep infections down on the ear, since it's, once again, going into the ear over and over again. You don't want to transfer any diseases between animals. So this is one that you want to make sure that you are using disinfectant, even though the other ones we say do not. This one will not be hurt by it. And I think that's it. It basically just take a step back and think about what you're doing when you're doing it, and it'll go great.
Great, Liz. Thank you. That was a very good presentation. Can you just refresh our memory again? I know you covered it early in the presentation, but kind of what the optimal storage temperature is for those vaccines?
It's between 35 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay.
Refrigerator should be good.
Yeah, I've always thought seeing that refrigerator data is pretty scary because it reminds us just how finicky those devices can be from time to time. So.
Well, and I remember my uncle's refrigerator that he used that, and I swear that thing was 30 years old. And so, yeah, you go back and think and you're like, yeah, I don't think I've ever seen a refrigerator that is brand new out in many shops, but they are relatively competitive. You can get one for $400 or $500, and that may not be a bad idea, especially if you've got a lot of head of cattle and a lot of money in your vaccines. It may be a good investment to put it, just buy a new fridge for outside in your shop.
Yes, for sure. For sure. Okay. Awesome, Lish. Thank you. At this time, I will go ahead and have our next person introduce our following speaker. Mr. Jared Petersilly is going to take over to introduce our next person.
All right, thank you, Clint. So our next speaker tonight is Dr. Justin Wagner. He's our Extension Beef Specialist, housed in the Southwest office at Garden City. Dr. Wagner has a very diverse background in applied nutrition, but is also well-versed in all aspects of ranch management, from employees to horses. So tonight he will focus on nutrition for the cows and heifers as we moved into a breeding season. So, and I'd also like to remind everybody that's viewing, regardless of your viewing choice, whether you're on YouTube, Twitter, we have agents that are monitoring all the sites, and we want to encourage everyone that has a question to either send it to one of us as an agent, whether you've got our phone numbers and you want to text us, whether you post a question to us, or you can post it straight to the chat on the if you're watching via Zoom. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Wagner and let him start his presentation. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Jared. Thank you all for tuning in with us this evening. If you'll give me just a minute, I'll see if I can get these screens pulled up, which is always the the first challenge, is to make sure that you all can see my slides. So. All right, Jared, did that come through okay on your end?
Yes.
Okay. All right, great. So this evening I'm going to be sharing with all of you some information on cow and replacement heifer programs, and ultimately it's about getting to a successful breeding season. Sometimes we forget how to advance those slides through Zoom. So, you know, a lot of times I think as producers, it's very easy for us to lose track of everything that goes into this moment. You know, for a lot of cattlemen and cattle women out there, you know, this is really kind of a tender moment where we've got that newborn calf there, but it's really easy to look past all the things that put in place to get there. And, you know, a lot of times we lose sight of the fact of, you know, that not all of our cows do make it to that standpoint, that we may have a few cows that are open, and that we ultimately may lose a few calves. And as I think about replacement heifers and bringing new females into the herd, replacement females represent a significant financial expense, as well as a significant investment in labor in getting them through their first breeding season and ultimately to having that live calf on the ground. If we think about the financial cost of those heifers, we're going to need at least, I typically say 3 to 5 calves, but you know, a fair number of calves to offset the initial investment in those development costs of bringing a heifer into a herd. And that's regardless of whether that's one that's raised on farm or one that we've went out and purchased. Now, the other reason that I think this is important to kind of focus back on the young cows and how we take care of them is that there's a fair number of cows that fall out of the cow herd fairly early and don't make it to where they fully cover the investment costs that we've put into them, especially those second calf cows. There's some real challenges there, and we'll address some of those maybe issues as we begin to talk about cow nutrition and getting them to that successful breeding season here this evening. So as a nutritionist, as I think about replacement heifer nutrition programs, to me, they're, it's sometimes best to not overthink it. As we look at, building these programs, the first thing we have to do with these heifers is to begin to set our development in terms of target weights. And then the other piece that we've got to do essentially is manage heifers to achieve those target weights. And typically in most cases, if we do that, we're going to be able to put those two things and choosing how we set those up and manage those heifers. If we take care of those things, usually heifer nutrition programs are pretty easy for producers to put together and to have some success with. So I wanted to start off with talking a little bit about how we establish these heifer target weights at breeding. Typically, we think about developing replacement heifers to achieve 55 to 60% of mature weight at breeding. And this is really an area where there is a little bit of debate going on, I think, right now, and there has been here for a few years. Historically, we've recommended that we develop heifers to 65% of their expected mature weight prior to breeding. There's some more recent research that's come out and documented that certainly lower target development weights may certainly be viable. The challenge with that is we need to have a larger number of females that maybe we can for potential replacement heifers, because obviously as we push those development targets lower, there's going to be a few heifers that probably don't achieve cyclicity at the time of breeding. And so, ultimately which development target weight is right for a particular operation, it really depends. If we're on an operation that really only is going to require a limited number of replacement females, I oftentimes recommend that we hit a target weight of 60 to 65% of that expected mature weight, just because we don't need a large number of females as replacement. And so with the thought being that that if we can get more of those heifers to cycle, less of them are going to fall out simply because we don't have as many available to us. However, on the other side, if we're very sensitive to costs, we want to reduce those development costs, and we've got access to a larger number of heifers, then there is a possibility of maybe looking at some lower target weights to develop those heifers. So it's certainly not a case of a one-size-fits-all approach. And oftentimes the increased number of heifers that if we do develop to a higher target weight, sometimes can offset the savings in terms of developing those heifers to a lower target weight. Now, we do have another target out here in the future that I think is really easy to forget about, and that's that we need those heifers to ultimately achieve 85 to 90% of their mature weight at the time they calve. And so we don't want to lose sight of that, especially as we get those heifers bred, we turn them out to grass, and they go through their first winter, and we really try to put them back into the mature cow herd at that point. So in terms of heifer nutrition and building a heifer nutrition program, one of the things that we need to have is, where are we starting at? And I know there's a lot of operations that will weigh cattle as at weaning time. There are others that may not have access to a scale. And if we're going to do a good job of building a heifer nutrition program, having an accurate weight of where we're starting on a group of heifers is really important. Obviously, as we set that target weight out in front of us, this is really going to establish how aggressive we need to be in terms of our nutrition program to achieve those targets. The other question that I often like to look at is, what's the weight distribution of the group? Here I've got kind of the standard bell-shaped curve of what we would expect is to be a very normal distribution in terms of a herd or a population of animals. What we see a lot of times, especially with groups of livestock, is that we'll see kind of a light end or a big end in terms of heifers. And so not only is it important to have a good sense of of what the current weight is of the heifers, but is there two distinct groups? Do we have a set of lighter heifers, and do we have a set of bigger heifers? I've had many situations in practice where I've actually had groups of heifers where there was a large end that they were essentially at the target weight at the time we started the development program, and there would be a lighter group in there. And we might change how we feed those two groups of heifers and develop them as we progress through the program. So not only look at what the current weight is, but how is it distributed, and is there some logical weight groups within a group of heifers that we're looking at. You know, the second piece of this that I think sometimes catches a few producers by surprise is as we begin to talk about, well, what's the expected mature weight of a cow today? And this is some data that I pulled from our K-State Focus on Feedlot data set. This would represent feedlot steers and heifers. And we can all see where that trend line is. We know in most recent years, you know, there's been a trend towards making feedlot cattle and harvesting those cattle at heavier exit weights. You know, those cattle originated from our cow herds. And so to me, it kind of stands to reason if we look at that pink line, where we're now, you know, marketing a lot of heifers somewhere in the above 1,250 pounds. And in some cases here in 2020, did push some heifer weights up to the 1,300 pounds. So it's very easily to see that we probably do have some larger mature weights on our cows. And so that's something that we need to take into consideration. You know, for me, I think that probably the average size cow in today's cow herd, and there is a range of weights that are out there all the way from the 1,200 on up to 1,400 pounds. A lot of times we'll work with what I call a 1,350 pound average cow today. And so if we take that and we put that into some consideration of where does that target weight be if we use those 55 to 65 that we're essentially looking at, if we use a 1,400 pound mature cow, we need to develop that heifer to somewhere around that 770 to 900 pounds. A lot of operations will use an 850 pound target to develop our heifers at breeding. If we consider at calving that 85 to 90% threshold, we're looking at an animal that at calving is going to weigh somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,200 pounds. And so if we look at the amount of weight that we're really talking about putting on these heifers during this development program, it's pretty common to start with a 600 pound heifer. If we use a 200-day program, we need to hit that target of 840 pounds. We need about 240 pounds of gain. And we're looking at building a nutrition program where that heifer is going to be able to gain about 1.2 pounds per day. So it's certainly one of the things with heifers is it doesn't take a very aggressive nutrition program to support these heifers. So the other part of a program as we begin to put a heifer nutrition program together is to look at, you know, how we develop those heifers in terms of putting that gain that we just talked about on these heifers in achieving that target weight. And here's some data from Lynch back in '97 that looked at two different development strategies: a late strategy where the heifers initially were allowed to gain about 1/4 pound per day, followed by a 2 pound per day average daily gain for 47 days. And then we have heifers that were put on what I call an even plane of nutrition, where they were gaining about 1 pound a day for the duration of the development period. We can see here in this that we've got age at puberty here. It was done for 2 years, year 1 and year 2. Difference between the late and even. A little bit of a difference here in terms of the age at puberty, where in this second year there were some differences here. If we look at first service conception rates, there is some differences here, but these are not significant. So we were seeing 55 and 56 here between the 2 years. If we look at pregnancy rates, they're similar as well. Other work, that's a little bit older, Clanton back in '83, compared early, even in late development regimes, there's really no difference in puberty, conception, or pregnancy rates among those heifers. And so what that really tells us is that as long as we achieve that target development weight, it really doesn't matter how we develop those heifers. And so the illustration that I use, just because I think it makes it a little bit more real to us, is, I picture 3 different development strategies that we could potentially use in a heifer development program. You can see the blue line is that steady, even, a pound per day, where we're taking these heifers from 600 to 800 pounds. If we look at that early strategy, maybe post weaning, we put these heifers on a plane of nutrition where they're going to gain about 1.5 pounds a day. And then about 100 days into the program, we're going to slow those heifers down and grow them at about 0.5 pound per day. The advantage of maybe growing these heifers a little more aggressively on the front end is that if we do have some environmental challenges, which do happen in the form of cold weather, we've grown these heifers, we're very close. We've only got about 100 pounds to put of additional body weight to put on those heifers as we get closer to breeding. The disadvantage maybe of doing this more aggressive strategy early on is that we are maintaining a larger animal over the development period. If we look at a later strategy where maybe we take these heifers post weaning, we turn them back out on dormant native grass with a little bit of supplementation. We target about 0.5 pound average daily gain, which for a lot of heifers, with some degree of supplementation and fairly decent forage availability, even on late season grass, we'll be able to do that fairly easily. Very low cost in this. And then grow those heifers a little bit more rapidly at that 1.5 pound per day rate as we get closer to breeding. So, a variety of different strategies that we can certainly use to develop heifers. All of them work very well. What's really important, though, is that we need to keep those heifers growing. We need to keep them on a positive plane of nutrition. We don't want it to set up a scenario where those heifers are growing and then they begin to slide backwards and lose weight on it. That's a situation where we may see some of those heifers that could start cycling, then stop, and it really creates some challenges. So, a lot of different ways that we can develop heifers that are out there, but what's important is to keep them on a positive plane of nutrition as we go forward in that development program and get closer to the time of breeding. The other thing I often remind producers, especially with these low input development programs, which seem to be very popular today, where we put these heifers back out on grass, or maybe we put them back out on milo or corn stalks, is it's really easy to feed them and forget them. If we think I talked a little bit about some of the advantages of those different strategies and the impact that weather can make. It's really not uncommon to see weather create a situation, especially if we are cold and wet, where we increase maintenance requirements and that begins to erode the amount of nutrients that are available for growth. So it's a standard practice for the producers that I work with that we're going to do check weights on these heifers at least 60 to 90 days prior to breeding. That gives us enough time that if we need to change our strategy and make sure if we need to feed these heifers a little bit more aggressively to reach that target weight. It also creates an opportunity if we do have a larger end of the heifers and a smaller end of the heifers, or maybe we begin to feed those heifers a little bit differently in our dry lot programs. In many cases, we can use one ration. We may full feed it to the lighter heifers and then limit feed it to the larger heifers, really just in an effort to cut costs and reduce that, and certainly not to overdevelop those heifers that are a little bit larger during the development period. One of the other issues that comes up, and we just had a question about it here at K-State here last week, was about some concerns over excess crude protein and if it's related to fertility as well as dystocia. I'm not going to touch on the dystocia too much this evening, but if we talk about the impacts of high crude protein content in the diet and its impact on fertility, there's some data that shows that it may reduce fertility in dairy cows. But as we get it a little deeper into the literature, there is also work that has demonstrated that it has a limited effect on cow fertility, and that there's no effect there. So it's really hard to go into the literature when we have some conflicting information and really come away with a solid conclusion about the impacts that crude protein might have on fertility, especially in beef heifers. The theory behind these crude protein levels is that if we have that soluble protein is going to increase serum urea nitrogen levels, or blood nitrogen levels. That's going to reduce our uterine pH, so make it more acidic, and essentially that's going to lead to the decrease in fertility. Now, granted, I'm not a reproductive physiologist, so this is kind of a nutritionist perspective on this. In terms of addressing the issue, what I think is important, or what I would like to stress, is that especially with a heifer development program, given the fact that we are dealing with a very high value animal to the operation, it's important for us to feed a balanced diet that meets the nutrient requirements and not grossly exceeds that. Two scenarios that do come up where we see some challenges, development diets that contain a high level of byproducts. Today's commodity prices where we're at, I don't foresee this being much of an issue with distillers grains, and some of the other byproducts that we would use are fairly high price right now, and the prices of protein that we see. This is probably more of an issue where we see high corn prices, but the byproducts might be a very attractive source of energy to put in there, or an economical source. The other place where we see a diet that can get fairly unbalanced very rapidly is wheat pasture. There we're looking at a forage that's lush, green, oftentimes is going to be greater than 20% crude protein on a dry matter basis. If we consider that many of these heifers, in terms of their maintenance protein requirement, total diet is going to be somewhere around that, somewhere between 11 and 13% a lot of times, that's vastly going to exceed what those requirements are. The other thing it gets into is, well, what's an excessive level of crude protein in the diet? And that begins to get a little more difficult to flesh out, given that protein requirements are a function of gain. So if we're more aggressively growing a set of heifers that might be a little bit behind, it's going to take more protein in the diet to support that gain. So, the take home, what do we do about it? So if we're in a situation where excess crude protein may be a concern in the diet, one of the things that I think helps us is that serum urea or blood urea nitrogen levels do respond very quickly to changes in the diet, typically within days. We've often recommended that we get at least 2 cycles on these heifers on some sort of a lower crude protein diet. However, you could make an argument that less could be required. I conferred with Dr. Johnson earlier today, and we were really discussing this issue, and she put it in the context of some of the synchronization protocols that we would use. And so we kind of came with this recommendation of 45 to 60 days on a lower crude protein diet is something that we might want to think about if we see that excess crude protein might be a concern. Just keep in mind that this is one of the areas that we we certainly don't have all the answers at this point. One of the other challenges that we often run into with heifer nutrition programs is this issue of spring greenup. We develop a lot of heifers in dry lots, and so those heifers, the nutrition is very, we're very precise in our nutrition, and so we begin to go through our breeding program, and then we're looking at turning those heifers out, and we turn them out where we've got just a little bit of green in an otherwise dormant pasture. So that green forage that's out there is very high quality, but the problem is there's not a lot of it. And so the other piece of that is supplementation is very difficult. That forage is very palatable. It's hard to get those cows to come to cake or any type of supplement. Unfortunately, there's really no easy answer to address this other than, it does happen. I've had some success using what I call, highly palatable supplements, namely dried distillers grains. We've also had some success utilizing a small amount of a development ration, really targeted at making sure that we didn't get a decline in that heifer's overall energy status, after we got her bred. And so the other option that is out there is I've had producers also look at delaying turnout of those heifers and keeping them in the dry lot program for a little bit longer before they turn them out on pasture. This is an option. A lot of times we're looking at, this could be adding 45 days or more to that development program and those costs. So it's certainly expensive, but unfortunately, it is something that we do run into a number of times on some heifers. So I used about half my time to address some of the issues with building a replacement heifer program, and I wanted to use the other half of the time to kind of talk about cow nutrition a little bit. And so I want to pose this question: well, what's the best way to ensure a successful breeding season on a set of cows? And really, it's another one of those series of, don't overthink it. The best way that we can ensure that we have a successful breeding season on these cows is to make sure that cow calves in good body condition. If those cows are in good condition at calving, we've built in a body reserve, and they're going to come through the breeding season in better shape. So one of the best tools that I think we have that a number of producers use, but some people may not be aware of, is body condition scoring cattle. And so this is a body condition scorecard that we developed at K-State. It's available online at the link there. Essentially, all this is it's a way to evaluate body fat reserves on a cow. A lot of times, if we look at cows, our optimum condition is going to be a 5 or 6. You can go through and kind of look at some of the physical characteristics associated with that. We tend to see a lot of cows. Thin cows are ones that we're going to have some challenges reproductively, are often going to be those that are in that category of the 3s and the 4s. We don't see very many 1s or 2s, and likewise we don't see very many 8s and 9s. There's a clear link between body condition score of cows and reproduction. And if we, think through this, it's very logical. If we have thin cows, it's going to take those cows longer to start cycling. And because of that, we're going to see lower conception rates. If we talk about those optimum condition scores of being a 5 or a 6, in this graph here, we see body condition score versus conception rate in cows. There's a break in this particular data if we look at 5 scores of 5, 6, or 7 versus those 3s and 4s. It's when we get to those scores of 5 and 6 that we really start to see a separation there between 3 and 4. So we often think of 5 and 6 as being the optimum body condition score for cows at calving, because that's going to lead us to have more success in terms of reproduction in the subsequent breeding season. So in terms of a management tool, how can we utilize body condition scores and tie that back to our nutrition program and management? And we can take body condition scores on a group of cows very easily. It's easy to roll out some feed, go back down the line of those cows and have your book there and start to mark down 3s, 4s, and 5s and put those in columns. So if we look at different production periods and how we might respond with our nutrition program and some management practices where we might intervene, especially to help us out in terms of looking at breeding these cows during the breeding season. So if we're in late lactation, a big factor here is going to be forage availability. What does that look like? If forage availability is low, we may need to implement some supplementation. We may also need to look at, if we have thin cows, certainly going to consider maybe weaning those cows and implementing an early weaning program. For me, one of the best times to body condition score cows is often at weaning. I'm going to look particularly at those young and older cows. If those cows are thin at weaning, the best time for us to put some condition back on a thin cow is post-weaning, because her nutrient requirements are relatively low at that point. So it doesn't take a lot of additional supplemental feed. Another good time point to take a look at your cows would be 100 days prior to calving. This is that last opportunity to gain body condition on those cows, especially because once we calve, if you look at the next column down, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for us to put weight on a cow post-calving. The requirements for early lactation are very high. And so it's going to be very difficult. Any additional feed resources that we go to are typically going to go towards just simply supporting the cows. Another time to evaluate condition on cows is during the breeding season. And sometimes we do find ourselves in situations where we may be in the middle of the breeding season. Our cows are thin. This does happen quite often in a drought situation where we've got to do some additional supplemental feeding. Here at this point, really what we're trying to do is not necessarily put gain on these cows because it's very difficult. They've often got a calf at side. So we're simply trying to maintain the condition that's on these cows. The other thing we can do is a lot of times by putting some additional feed resources into these cows, we can stimulate those cows to begin to cycle if there are some challenges there. And so it can go a long ways towards maybe getting us out of that situation where we maybe have gotten a little bit behind on a particular set of cows. So as we talk about cow nutrition, one of the things that, especially if we've had an issue in a herd where we've had some subpar pregnancy rates, is we often look at the nutrition. And where I see a lot of producers go is they often go, well, my mineral program was lacking. And, for me, as I think of just the hierarchy of nutrients, a lot of times the big rocks to say in terms of cattle nutrition are energy and protein. And so minerals and vitamins fall below that. So when we begin to see big production problems, lower than expected pregnancy rates, a lot of times I'm going to look more at the energy and protein levels of the nutrition program than I am more specifically at the minerals and vitamins. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we can't have some mineral antagonisms or other issues that might be out there. It just means don't overlook those two big rocks in terms of energy and protein. And so I want to spend a little bit of time kind of diving into energy and protein and how they work in terms of cow nutrition. We spend a lot of time talking about protein supplementation, and I think it's very easy for us to forget about energy. So energy is what drives cow condition. In terms of protein, as many of you know, we're feeding the rumen microbes. We're trying to improve forage digestibility, increasing intake. And as we increase intake of that forage, it increases the amount of energy that's available, which is in turn going to increase cow condition. So it is a bit cyclical in that protein really does drive energy status within the cow. So let's dig a little bit deeper and look more specifically at cow requirements over the production year. And these are the graphs that I use. The big drivers in terms of nutrient requirements for beef cows are going to be body weight and lactation. And what you see here is really two cows. We have a 1,200 pound cow that's going to produce 20 pounds of peak lactation, represented in the blue line. Then a 1,400 pound cow represented by the red line that's going to be that produces 20 pounds of milk. And then kind of the higher producing 1,400 pound cow that's going to have a much higher lactation potential. And so we've got weaning on either side of the extremes of this graph. But what's also important is not just to look at the requirement of the cows, but also to begin to put it in context of what the quality of some of the forages and feedstuffs that we might have available to us. So this brown line would represent a 5% crude protein forage. This cow is going to consume that around 2.2% of body weight. We'll click in some green forage that would be 11% crude protein. I'll click in a 7 here with the thought of, as you begin to look at your operation and get a sense, what I want you to do is to get a sense of where those cow requirements are relative to some of these different qualities of forages that we might have access to. Now you can see, especially with these higher producing cows, even on green forage that's relatively high in terms of its crude protein content, we've still got a gap there. We also have some gaps up front here. As we look at, right prior to calving, there's quite a bit of space in terms of those protein requirements. And so one of the things that we would often do is we talk about protein supplementation, right? So here's that standard of that 4 pounds of a 20% crude protein supplement. So you can see it very easily fills that gap in terms of covering those cows' protein requirements, with the exception of that ultra high producing cow that's producing 30 pounds of peak lactation. That's also the 1,400 pound cow. So let's look at energy requirements versus supply. Very similar setup in terms of the graph, in terms of the same cows. We'll click in some different forages of different qualities. Here we do have to take into account when we supplement protein, we would expect to see an increase in that dormant forage base. So that's what's going to be represented by this line that I just clicked in here. So that 2.2% of body weight would represent a cow that is protein supplemented. So we are getting a little bit of more forage intake into that cow. As we look at green forage, it's going to be 0.65. We see that, that does a nice job of certainly covering most of those cows' requirements, even during peak lactation. However, we do still have a gap right there in the, if we look in that third trimester leading right up to calving, if we're doing that, especially on a dormant forage base, we are going to have a deficit where our forages, especially dormant low quality native range here, is supplying around 11 megacals of energy. Cows' requirements are somewhere in the neighborhood of 15. So we've got about a 4 to 5 megacal per day deficit in terms of our energy requirement, especially right up in that time prior to calving during that third trimester. And so I show this because I want people to begin to be aware of that's where we begin to lose condition on a cow, especially if we find ourselves in that scenario where we may calve a little bit earlier. And so that time frame to green forage that's going to be of higher energy density is going to be a little bit more delayed. These are the areas that this is where we begin to lose that body condition on that cow that may create some challenges for us, especially during the subsequent breeding season, if we don't address it through some supplementation or, strategically kind of using some supplementation or being aware of where those gaps might exist in terms of our overall program. And I think awareness is just a big part of the battle. The other thing we can do is to build a good sufficient condition reserve in those cows as we come into those winter months, knowing that we may certainly have some challenges in terms of that cow's energy supply as we get closer to calving. So I also, this time of year especially, like to talk a little bit about cold stress. This is one of those things where, a day or two here, we often don't think of it having a significant impact. However, if we come through a much more extreme winter, in the feedlot industry, it's not uncommon to see cattle back up quite a bit and be 100 pounds behind over the course of the winter. So cold stress to me is something that can be a little bit additive, and it is create another challenge for a set of cows, especially if we don't address it. And so cows can begin experiencing cold stress when they have a dry winter hair coated around 18 degrees Fahrenheit. That's where that lower critical temperature is at, and that's on a dry coat. However, if that coat becomes wet, it doesn't insulate the cow as well, and so we can start to see cold stress at much, much higher temperatures. Here it's at around 59 degrees. We certainly don't think of that as being cold stress in the middle of the winter, but if those cows are wet, that's where we can begin to see it. So if we think about where we've been most recently, cold stress will increase maintenance energy requirements. It doesn't increase protein. And so it's about 1% for each degree below the lower critical temperature. So if we look at 18 and we think about a situation where the daytime high might be somewhere in the neighborhood of that below, around 10 degrees, on those particular days, we would actually have a 10% increase in maintenance energy requirements on a cow. And so as we look at how we respond to cold stress, we have to consider the duration and severity. We do have, 1 day of cold weather. However, in terms of generating that response, I usually think of 2 consecutive days of extreme cold or a winter storm front moving through where we may need to respond by increasing the amount of energy that's available to those cows. Cold weather also decreases grazing behavior, especially on cows that are in extensive environments like milo or corn stalks. And so what I often recommend is that we replace that graze forage intake and increase the energy content. One of the easiest ways for us to do that is to utilize hay is very commonly used, but to use a little higher quality hay than what those cows are currently grazing on. If the cold stress becomes extreme, we may want to look at some concentrate feeding sources or using a combination supplement that brings both energy and protein to the table. Many of the byproducts fit that scenario very well, where we can increase a pound or 2 of additional supplement that might bring some additional energy in the table to offset that increase in energy requirement that those cows are experiencing. I also want to talk a little bit about some other tools that are out there in terms of technology. If we look at the cow-calf segment, we don't think of them as being, large adopters of technology. And so there's some feeding technologies, ionophores. Everyone's, fairly common ones are Rumensin and Bovatech. These certainly can be utilized, both Rumensin and Bovatech in the case of a replacement heifer. Rumensin, however, is the only ionophore that has a label approval to be used in mature beef cow. And so that's something to keep in mind. But these are certainly feeding technologies. They've been around for a number of years, since the late number of years, and widely used in the feedlot industry, but we don't see a lot of use in the cow-calf segment. And so there is some linkages. If we look at, simply put, Rumensin, these products are going to reduce the amount of feed required. They're going to improve the energy status. There is documented research that, it can impact puberty as well as cyclicity most if we feed these products to replacement heifers. I did pull a little bit of data from one of the Elanco tech bulletins. That's essentially a large trial summary with well over some cows that looked at feeding Rumensin at 0, 50, or 200 levels. We look at the feed intake, which is the first red box here. I talked about it requiring less feed. If you look at that percent of control, 194.8 and 89.2. So we're at about that 10% less feed to maintain cows at essentially the same condition. If we look at the days from calving to conception, we see 93, 87 to 87. And the percent conception as well. Now, in terms of including Rumensin in a commercial supplement, that's something that's going to have to be included at a mill. It is recommended at that 200 milligram per head per day level. It should be fed in at least 1 pound of dry feed per day. So there is some label requirements that we have to be aware of, but it is a technology that's out there, and quite honestly, it's probably underutilized. If we look at the cost per day, we're looking at something that's going to be probably in the neighborhood of 3 to 5 cents per head per day, depending on the situation, to include something like Rumensin in there. And we do see a response even at those lower levels. So it is something to consider, especially if you are using some sort of a commercial supplement. It's a little more difficult if you're using what I call a commodity blend of either corn or DDGs as a supplement on your cows, but certainly something that should be considered. So what are my thoughts on, as we begin to wrap things up on a successful breeding season? If we look at both replacement heifers as well as cows, I think one of the biggest things that we need to do is simply plan ahead and prepare. Plan your work and work your plan. That's really what we're doing in a replacement heifer program. I also think it's, as we look at, what are some cows that we really need to pay attention to, and that's those younger cows in terms of monitoring cow condition. We need to do that on the cow herd, and that can be using body condition scoring, turning that into a record at different times during the year, and really responding appropriate. The last piece of this is, I think it's important for cattle producers to have an understanding of nutrient requirements, but relative to forage quality in the context of the system that they're in. A lot of times we do tend to do a lot of what I call, supplementation and supplemental feeding. Those are different. But what really where I think we need to move towards is doing some strategic supplementation. Are we putting that supplementation in the right place, in the right amount, at the right time, and really kind of having an understanding of the balance of not only nutrient requirements, but forage quality, as well as available forage and supply, which are really the two big factors at the ranch level that tend to drive a lot of our management decisions. And so with that kind of wraps up what I brought with me here this evening, and took a good chunk of the time that was allotted to me. And so I guess I'll turn this back over to Jared here and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Justin. I am going to now turn this over to Sandra as we progress down our list of speakers. She will introduce Rachel. Sandra Wick is our extension agent in the Post-Rock district. And I would like to personally thank Sandra because of all of the work that they've done in getting us set up with the technology that is available through that district and being able to link this through YouTube and Twitter. They have some neat feeds and some neat tools there. So thank you, Sandra, for helping in doing that. And I'll let you continue on.
Okay, all righty. Thanks, Jared. And good evening to everybody. Thanks for sticking us out here. We've kind of been long on here, so we do appreciate you staying on and getting some information. Again, I am the Post-Rock District crop and livestock agent recently. So I've enjoyed kind of being on the livestock side as well. So Post-Rock District covers 5 counties. That would be Jewell, Lincoln, Osborne, Smith, and Mitchell counties. So it's an honor for me to be able to announce our last speaker here, a neighboring agent in the Phillips Rooks district, Rachel Boyle. She has been in extension about 16 years, and she is the ag agent there, although she focuses maybe a little bit more of her efforts on the livestock side, but she also covers other areas as well. So I am going to turn it over to Rachel, and she's going to visit with you a little bit about a resource tool for you to use called the Management Minder.
Good evening, and Sandra, thanks for that nice introduction. It's good to join all of you here on the Winter Ranch Management Seminar. And we've laid out some groundwork for all of you to be successful in your cow-calf management and some tools that can help you as well. As Sandra said, I want to visit with you about the Management Minder. But just some things, I guess, that were brought up this evening that I think are foremost and important. Sandy Johnson brought up using bull soundness exams and, you know, the importance of that. Justin was talking about making sure that our heifers are appropriate weights, and also in our cows, managing those body condition scores. And then Alicia brought out the point of using vaccines and storage and handling and getting those ordered. So Sandra, I want you to go ahead and if you'd start the little video, because of my internet, I pre-recorded a video in case we didn't have great internet this evening, but just wanted to talk to you about Management Minder, and that video will do that for us. Are you like me and need a reminder just to get things done, and you'd like reminders for your own cattle operation as well? Well, I want to talk to you about Management Minder. Management Minder is a web-based tool that will send calendar reminders to your smartphone device. How cool is that? So you can find Management Minder at ksubeef.org on the homepage. You want to scroll down. On the right-hand side, you'll find quick links, and Management Minder is a link below that. So click on Management Minder, and you'll come to the Management Minder homepage. We have 3 K-State beef extension specialists that have been working on Management Minder, Sandy Johnson, Dale Blasey, and Greg Hanslachek. This is also a program that's being developed with Iowa State University as well. I want to draw your attention to a couple links that are available on the Management Minder. One is the user guide, and then the other is the appendix of available activities. And this will be a listing of all the activities that are listed within Management Minder that you can add to your calendar of operations. The first thing that you would want to do is go to the registration page to register your farm or ranch. So you would enter your farm and ranch name, your first name, your last name, and all the other information there with the red asterisks by those boxes. You would enter your username and a password so that you can come back in to make changes if you need to on your specific calendars. The one nice thing about Management Minder is there can be multiple users. So for instance, if you have a farm manager or another employee that needs access to the calendar dates and reminders, you can give them their own username and password as well so they get the same information. You would hit submit, and then that would register you for Management Minder. And I've already done that, so I'm going to go further down and just click on login. And here you would enter your farm and ranch name, your username, as well as your password, and then click enter. Once you've done that, it brings you to the different calendar options. And one of those is the manual build calendar, where you manually enter the different activities, the date that you want those activities to show up on your calendar. And each of these items has to be entered individually. It takes a little bit of time to do that. I would encourage you to use the automated calendars, and you have a breeding and calving calendar, the grass turnout, receiving calendar, as well as a weaning calendar too. And these would populate, and then you can unselect the items that you don't use or that you don't want in your calendar as reminders. Now at this time, the server is having some issues. We had planned to show you the full program, but I want to show you the spreadsheet that kind of simulates what the calendar would do, and as it sends those dates into your own personal phone or another device that you may want to use. So let's take a look at that spreadsheet. Here's the Excel spreadsheet, and this particular one is for replacement heifers. And you'll notice that the information in it hinges on your heifer breeding date, which is up here at the top, and we have entered in April 25th of 2021. Now here's all the different activities or items that partake in the heifer development program. So you would have different vaccinations, your nutrition level, checking their weights. Justin kind of went over some of this information in developing heifers and how important that nutrition is for those heifers. Particularly once you get down here to when the third trimester begins, right there before calving, and you need to plan for needed weight gain on those heifers. And for this instance, with an April 25th breeding date, we're going to be looking at those heifers November 1st to check for added weight. And then also our calving date you see here is for February 4th of 2022. Now let's take a look as we change our breeding date. Let's make it a month later and see how that changes the dates within the calendar. You'll see that it repopulates those. So now our calving date is actually March 6th of 2022. So this is helpful. If you're using a paper form calendar, you can still use this spreadsheet and enter these dates and items for your cattle production management. And if you're using a smartphone or something like that, you can go in your calendar and do the same thing where you would enter the item on that particular date. So we're happy to help with any reminders and tools and tips and tricks that you may need as you move forward with your cattle planning and cattle operations. So if we can be of any assistance to you, and if you would like one of these spreadsheets, just contact your local K-State Research and Extension office or one of us on the planning committee for the winter ranch management, and we would sure get that spreadsheet to you. If you have any questions at this time, I will take those. Thank you. Thank you, Sandra, for playing that. And I might just open it up if there are any specific questions at this time for the Management Minder that I can address.
There's none coming in from Twitter, Rachel.
Okay. like to
Sandy,
turn it over to Clint.
Okay, alrighty. Well, thanks so much, Rachel. And I know that's a very useful tool for producers to use. So as Rachel said, just contact any of us and we will make sure that we get you the information. So now I'm going to turn it back to Clint.
Yeah, thank you all. And thanks again to our 4 great presenters tonight. Really did appreciate each one of your guys' presentations. Right now, I just wanted to check with the folks on Facebook and YouTube. Right now, I've been the guy monitoring Twitter, and I don't have any questions right now. But if you folks out there have any questions, please put those down in the comments on those websites. And then for the folks here on Zoom, if you guys want to unmute yourselves and ask a question for the town hall Q&A. We'll bring back all 4 of our presenters here, and then if you don't feel comfortable doing that, go ahead and throw it in the chat, and yeah, I'll just maybe wait a little while and see if we get any feedback from YouTube and Facebook as well. Okay, no questions on Facebook, says.
All right, Clint, I'm going to start off with a couple questions that were posed to me. First was, what is a ballpark estimate for a yearly carrying cost on a spring calving cow? With all the magazines that say we need to watch expenses and cut costs, which ones can we justify cutting first and foremost?
Which of our panelists would like to tackle that one?
I will give my 2 cents on some of that. I don't remember the most recent total annual cost for the cows from our Farm Management Association, but certainly those costs have been going up. And I think it's, feed costs are still the highest proportion of that total annual cost. And so that seems like the first place that a person would start. And without knowing anything else about the operation, it's hard to know if there's room there or not. But as the large expense, I think it's important to recognize the cost associated with feed delivery methods. And, a lot of times we think spending money is, costs are increasing, but sometimes spending money may help us save money. And knowing how much feed you deliver and knowing what your animals weigh so that you can match them appropriately sometimes can be a good investment in figuring out how to manage those costs. And I see Justin has those more recent costs there, and I'll let him chime in at this point.
Yeah, Sandy, I was just trying to support your cause there. So it took me a little while to find the unmute button. Yeah, so this is I just happen to have this in the back of the presentation there. There would be some more recent numbers that maybe get to Jared that would be represented 2019. So I don't have those, but this gives you a rough idea of where those costs have maybe been at for the last few years since 2014. The blue bars would represent feed costs, the red would represent non-feed costs. And, those costs, I think what always jumps out to me when I look at this data is, we talk about feed costs, and that line is actually kind of trending down here, which, if we think about where we were at commodity prices in 2014, that's not all that much of a surprise. But you look at that non-feed cost or those operational dollars, and that's where I think, we still have to feed cows. We still have to take care of cows. A lot of times we're at the mercy of the markets to some extent. So, Jared, to your point about what things can you cut, a lot of times I'm going to look at those operational, where did we spend those operational dollars? Was that in equipment repairs or pieces, or, taking a second look at some of those dollars and where they're going. I know on one particular operation, they were just kind of had the conversation. They had tracked repair costs on their feed pickup and decided it was time for a new feed pickup because they'd spent about 10 grand in it the last year. And so, that's what I would encourage producers to do, is not only look at the feed costs, but those other areas where they might be able to save a few dollars in terms of cost cutting.
Kind of along the same lines, either of our panelists, it's been pretty dry out there, pretty much all over the state, maybe the western 2/3. So when do I stop feeding and start selling? And that be maybe the $1 million question. Some of the markets, or the coal cow markets, tend to be fairly low now. Some of the areas, and maybe some of the cows and the dairy cattle are already selling. So what's some of your recommendations?
I think, Sandra, that's, the answer to that question is really a little bit maybe different for each individual operation. I think, some critical components are, taking a really kind of a forage inventory of what resources are available, what do those look like, obviously, and then having some sort of a structured plan in terms of, what cows are we going to sell. I know we certainly start thinking about things, we're kind of on the other side of pregnancy detection on most operations, but certainly, having some sort of a plan of, well, can I thin this herd to some extent, and what manner am I going to do it? The other thing you mentioned, the cull cows, there's an opportunity in some instances to add value to those cows depending on the condition. So it's not only looking at, well, reducing the number of mouths we have to feed, but also maybe, are there some other options that might be out there for those alternatives too, rather than just, but it all kind of comes back to resource availability a lot of times, and what they've got on hand. And I think, it's as we look at, especially for me in Southwest Kansas, it's really not uncommon for us to have dry winters. So just over the years I've gotten, and Jared as well, several of us that are located in this part of the world, things can change dramatically as we get into April and May. And so it's always kind of a, having a drought management plan. I think it was some target dates that are based on historical turnout is always a good thing to have as well. So.
And the other thing I would just add is having a good handle on your total production costs help you assess, okay, if I'm going to start feeding for an extra month, what does that do to my break even? And, one of the challenges obviously with the drought is market timing. And as Justin talks about the plan, you wait too long and everybody's gone to town and the price really drops. So, having that plan in place and a good sense of your costs will, I think, help you manage that as best you can. And there's not a single good one answer, as he says.
So kind of following along with that, Justin, I guess this will be kind of geared to you, and lots of operations are going to have some variations in this, but as we've seen the grain prices increase, the calf prices actually held pretty good. So what kind of a cost of gain should we look at or look to stay under to make the backgrounding still work? Or as you were relating it to developing those replacement heifers and trying to get that half a pound to pound and a half gain.
Yeah, it's always, I think the nature question kind of gets into, it's anytime we do a program, where we're going to grow those calves, one of the tools that I recommend that, is beefbasis.com, kind of running out there. And what that tool is going to use is you can place a value on the calves today. Then you can also look at marketing those calves at some point in the future. And really what we're trying to get out of that exercise with that tool is actually kind of look at the value of gain. And so then, once we've kind of got, well, what's the 600-pound calf worth relative to a 700-pound calf at some point in the future, we got to know what kind of dollars, in essence, we've got to work with. And so, then you can look at feedstuff, commodity prices, as it gets to, predicting what the cost of gain is going to be on an operation or some thresholds. Through the focus on feedlots, one of the tools that I put together is a regression equation where we can actually estimate feedlot cost of gain based on corn price with the regression equation. And so that's listed in if you go to our K-State focus on feedlots, it's in a publication called the Annual Review. And so a lot of times what that'll allow producers to do is we can, if they don't have a good handle on what their commodity prices are going to be or what that ration is going to look like, we can get an estimate of what feedlot cost of gain would be if we were to put those calves in a feedlot. So, that's kind of a nice first step if they're pretty early on running those numbers to see what those might look like. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit different, for a backgrounding operation than a full commercial feedlot. But it's a really good place to start, I think, in terms of looking at those and looking at value of gain versus cost of gain and what might be left. A lot of times in a backgrounding program, I would say it's not uncommon for us to be at about 80% the value of feedlot cost of gain sometimes, but there's a wide range that are out there of costs potentially, Jared. So.
All right, thank you.
Anybody else have any questions for the panelists? If you want to have some time to maybe think of one while you're thinking, we'd really appreciate you guys sticking with us here. We've just been in a little over 2 hours, so hope you guys had a good, valuable program with us this evening. We'd ask for those of you who are on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, mainly because those folks may not have actually registered for the program. If you guys could hold up your smartphone to the screen and get that QR code, it'll take you right to a survey for us. And really what we're aiming to do with these surveys is really get a good idea of what sort of value you took from these 4 topics that we listened to tonight. And then also that'll help us, evaluate and see what we can do into the future. Those of you who did register, Alicia, she'll actually send you guys a link probably in the email tomorrow for everyone who had registered. So if you wanted to wait till that, go for it. If you wanted to do it right now and then disregard the email tomorrow, that's fine too. I was asked to mention also, if you guys are interested in getting copies of these presentations, make sure and ask one of us extension agents, and we can make sure and get that to you in terms of presentations, PowerPoints, any of the publications that were mentioned throughout tonight. We might very well could have a hard copy in one of our offices, and if we don't, we can sure pull one for you. Also, a lot of our publications are all online as well, in PDF form, and so sometimes it might be hard to track one down, but that we're here to help facilitate that. Also, we're going to have recordings of all the sessions tonight. Our goal is to have those available probably next week. And depending on the local unit, those will be posted either to YouTube or Facebook or Twitter based on our own individual accounts. So that's where those will live. And again, if you have a hard time finding the recordings, just reach out to us and we would be happy to pass those along. Also, in terms of that as well, I wanted to echo Jared and thank Post Rock District for getting those streams available for us. And Shannon Rogers is she's their social media expert. So Shannon, we sure do appreciate you facilitating that as well for us tonight. Looks like I'm getting some chats here. Well, Alicia Bohr, she actually put the link to, if you don't have a smartphone, at HTTPS link right there. If you wanted to access that in the Zoom chat, that's where you can do that as well. And Dr. Johnson said that also recordings will be at the ksubeef.org page. And if you go there, there's actually another sub page called Winter Ranch Management. So you click there and that's where you'll find the recordings. Any other questions that came through elsewhere while I was giving my goodbye spiel? Doesn't look like it. All right. So thank you all for joining us tonight. If you're on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, you can navigate away now. If you're on Zoom, go ahead in the bottom right-hand corner. There'll be a red box that says leave. You can go ahead and click on that and we'll make sure that everyone